originally, when we did this piece before Christmas in November, it was just a sharing session. We've been doing periodic sharing sessions as part of a large-scale European funded project that we've been active on for the last 2 years. So we've been doing regular sharing sessions around the agenda of learning ecosystems for climate action. So our project is called LEVERS. It stands for Learning Ventures for Climate Justice, and it's formed around the themes of learning ecosystems, of open partnerships which bring together different voices to work together in a learning context. That could be formal learning or informal learning. We've been chipping away at this agenda over various projects over a number of years. This project in particular, under the banner of First Hand, is an attempt to work this agenda through to industry learning, to try and open up conversations about the type of change that needs to happen in industry and in business, and to see where we could get to through a series of prototypes and developing our agenda through communities of practice, through networks, and through live prototype learning events. We've been active on this project for a couple of years. We're facing into our last year, and we've really built some pieces, I guess you could call infrastructure in a way. We have an active community of practice, which brings together a dozen or 14 people taken from sector organizations, universities, local government, community organizations, and industry. And we're meeting with them to work through ideas about the skills needed for the kinds of change that we would like to see, and also looking deeper into practical examples through that community of practice, and then in live events where we're doing the same thing, but we're doing it on site, in an industrial site, in a factory, in a brewery. We've been to an underground tunnel on the Thames, and we're looking at sites of industry to get inspiration, to create exchange, and to develop the skills that we need for changes coming to industry. And in fact, the title of this slide, "This Cannot Be Done in Isolation," is taken from the head of sustainability at IKEA, who is working in interesting ways into their supply chain. And you're starting to see the kinds of collaboration and collective action that we're talking about when we talk about that the only way is open, that we need to work in ecosystems, that we need to solve problems collectively. These types of ideas are seeded in big business. They're just not quite penetrating through to the places that we need to see more of that collective action. So we're seeing it in Tesla with their open source patents. We're seeing it with Fashion Pact between Gucci and Adidas and other luxury brands. We're seeing it, as we'll see, with Boston Consulting Group talking about ecosystemic working. We need this kind of activity to penetrate through from that level down and from grassroots level up to reach more parts of industry. So our agenda that we've stretched from November, having a sharing event and introducing that and having a fantastic conversation with the 15 or 20 people who turned up, we're turning this into a series this year. In today's session, I'd like to take you through quickly what's stopping us. So looking at blockers, if the agenda is an idea of openness and collective action, if we agree that it's not optional for business anymore, then what's stopping us from taking action, and how might we start or expand on existing practice? And then in following months, we'll be taking some of the work that we're doing, some of the work that we're working through with our community of practice, and sharing it in some open skills deep dives. So every other month this year, we'll be doing another session of The Only Way is Open, and we may just promote it more, so perhaps we have more of an audience. But today, I think it's worth just taking you through these slides, having a little conversation about your own experiences, and building this agenda through the year. And our starting point for this agenda is, I think there's a couple of touchstones that we have in our work. And this visualization of the Sustainable Development Goals is the first. And it's a way of looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, which is not very common, and I believe should be. It's called the cake version, where you have not a hierarchy in terms of importance, but certainly a set of relationships where you see the biosphere as the foundation, society as dependent on that biosphere and the economy dependent on society. But that vertical that you see through the middle, that straight line through, leads up to Sustainable Goal 17, which is partnership for the goals. And I've seen that referred to in UN literature as the goal upon which all other goals depend. If we cannot learn to work together through the biosphere, society, and economy, the other goals fail. So this way of representing it highlights this dependency, and this is the foundation for our work under levers and under First Hand. The second touchstone takes this on to a business context, so looking at the economy. I mean, we stumbled over this accidentally at some point through, and we thought it was just a beautiful, immediate, fun, clever way to represent what we're looking for in the work we're doing. It's an idea of a traditional business and their supply chain, which is discrete and independent from their customers, and which is discrete and independent from their relationships with employees, is a traditional form of doing business on which many of our challenges have their roots on. This idea that each of these relationships can be played through in isolation and do not have impacts on each other, and likewise that they might not have impacts on other parts of society, other institutions, and of course on the natural world and the natural environment. So that diagram on the right, which could be redrawn, the way that it's been drawn by Piotr here, centers business, but effectively the implication is that any of these nodes could be the center of it. So it's being drawn from the perspective of business. You could redraw this from the perspective of communities, academics, governments. All need to cultivate and equally contribute to these relationships. And so these two diagrams, the idea of needing to build partnership for the goals and needing to create these mutual reciprocal relationships, are the start of our interest. I'm taking, this is an illustration of the Thames Tunnel, the tunnel under the Thames, where we launched First Hand our attempt to cultivate and nurture these new ways of working. We started in the Thames Tunnel in July last year. We went to this piece of infrastructure, which started in the early 1800s as a technical innovation, the first tunnel to go under a river. It relied on biophilic design. It was hugely influential in terms of its innovation. And that spirit of innovation, the idea of Brunel, both Isambard Kingdom and Mark Brunel, who in fact was responsible for this, his father, is a idea of technological innovation, which carries through to this day. This idea that we can innovate our way out of challenges, we can innovate our way to growth and to economy. We started our project here for a good reason, because we retold the story of this project through the impacts on local communities, through the contributions of local communities, through the contributions of government actors and other stakeholders, and how this project, this innovation, was as skilled in the way that it worked these networks and ecosystems and relationships as it ever was in terms of its technological innovation. But if we do not tell those stories, if we do not focus in on those skills, we don't value them. We also can't replicate them or scale them. They do not get valued in the same way as the technological skills which we focus on. So our effort is to retell those stories, but also to create those kinds of peer exchanges which start to recognize the value of all these stakeholders. As I say, that's something that's happening. This is a quote from Boston Consulting Group talking about the way that independent economic players are working together, the rise of business ecosystems. We believe, of course, that those ecosystems don't exist independent of society, of community, and of those other institutions which enable and equip those businesses to perform, so universities, community groups, etc. So the reason behind, and this is the first talk that we did last year, really talked about the drivers for this shift. The idea that openness and collaboration in business are no longer optional is more widely held than you might think. So the idea of business as operating in competition through its very bones, through its very DNA, and through often regulation, through market, cartels and monopolies commission, working to force business into competition to the advantage of the consumer is something that, we're told is good, which it is. But the kinds of systemic challenges that we're facing mean that those kinds of competitive models can't hold. We need to solve those systemic challenges. We also need to cultivate new ideas and unlock innovation, something which is better done in collaboration than it is in silos. We know that we need to build community support for change and to share benefit. So if we want the change which is to come to not simply save some parts of communities, but reflect a wider community's needs and tap into a wider community's talents, we need to engage those communities and center those communities in these conversations. Business needs to attract and retain talent. And this idea that you dedicate your life to a single silo and that specific benefit, I think, is something which is increasingly outdated in new generations who understand in different ways what the impact of the type of competitive and open market businesses have on wider society. And we also need to pool knowledge and resources to create efficiencies and find new business models. So what this looks like, this is an interesting diagram from the Systems Innovation Network, and it's simply the bottom line simply maps the idea that you can control, that you have agency over something. So from cooking a meal on the left-hand side of the bottom, you have complete control on the decisions which are made. You don't need to enact influence, you can make those decisions. And then to the right-hand side, as you move across that line of agency, you have multiple actors, you have multiple people involved. They may have different opinions, they may have different incentives to make different decisions to the ones that you might wish. On the left-hand side, going up the vertical, you have dimensionality. So, what are the implications? What are the impacts? How many people are involved? Not simply in terms of control, but in terms of impact. So you can see things mapped across here in terms of the simple decisions that you can enact yourself. And to some degree, many businesses have lived in a relatively simple, or certainly if they're complicated, they're not getting into the areas of the complex unless they are global businesses. You could have relative control over your supply chain. You could secure that supply chain if you're a retailer. You didn't have to think about your wider impact. And that shift is that shift toward complicated and then wicked problems, wicked problems being problems which have no clear and independent cause, and so cannot be solved with a type of solution which is direct, but which needs to take into account multiple factors. That shift from even that idea about cooking a meal, if you're impacted by climate change and food security, if you're concerned about the obesity crisis, even those simple decisions have become more complex in the world that we're living in. And so those traditional ways of solving those problems don't apply. So in the session before Christmas, we went into a few examples of how businesses are entering new ways of working. And we took you on a little tour of some not only inspiring, I think the idea that you might storytell in this space and that might be sufficient. I think we're presenting these examples as examples we can learn from. Hi, Jill, and welcome to our boutique group. So in November, we went through a whole set of these examples, businesses which are working in different ways, which are working more openly, more collectively, And they're doing it in a skilled way. And I think that was one of the points of when we introduced this agenda, was to draw attention to them, not because they echo this kind of call for collaboration, this call for inspiration, that they tell their story really well. They're doing it at scale. They're doing it in a very strategic way, in a skilled way. And they've started and they're iterating and they're learning in public. So I think the reason for bringing these examples through is not only to have that kind of set of case studies, it's to give us this food for thought, which can fuel not just conversations, but action. And the reason for coming back around to this conversation today is to think about how can we use these examples and how can we use them to set our own skills agendas. So one of the first, I'm just showing, re-showing 4 of the examples from the last session in November. Tony's open chain is one of the most, and I hate to use the word inspiring, because I think it kind of, it kind of positions examples in a certain way. So it becomes like, oh, I love them, but I don't know how they do it. They do it in the open. They're telling their story all the time. And they've started to reach targets which are really significant and bring in partners. And what are they doing? They're looking at how to improve the supply chain, specifically looking at things like child labor, worker conditions. They're working into an industry, the chocolate industry and the chocolate supply chain, which is one of the most problematic on earth, which is saying something. They started by themselves, which is where the Chocolonely name comes from, that Tony was working independently and alone. And their quest has been to reform the supply chain, not for their own advantage, but for mutual advantage. So they're working on Tony's open chain as an independent project. They're working in public and they're achieving scale. So really one to look at in terms of securing supply chain, something that all businesses are interested in, whether they're doing it in terms of, their moral compass, or whether they're simply doing it for their economic and financial stability. So really want to watch there. Northumbrian Water, all water companies are being, have incredible challenges at the moment, and they're failing in public. If Tony's succeeding in public, water companies are all failing in public. So unless they can find ways to change their ways of working, we're all affected by these kinds of challenges. What Northumbrian Water have done, and they've done it in a form of a festival, an innovation festival, which I must admit, when I heard about first, I rolled my eyes and thought, okay, another festival, a lot of bunting, a lot of people looking very excited, a lot of talk about, bringing in stakeholders, participatory practices, etc. But what we've seen through Northumbrian Water, one of the members of our community of practice, is real commitment to bringing this back into the business and to creating mutual benefit, all working alongside each other. So they're bringing stakeholders, they're bringing their team, they're identifying problems through it, they're working on problems with it, through it, and they're also engaging wider communities and securing their future. So they're working on all aspects of challenges that they have, including, it has to be said, recruitment and retention. They turned the whole thing into a work experience project this year. So they set the target of 1,000 young people getting work experience through the delivery of a festival that they've been doing for years anyway. So they're always looking for that win-win. They're always looking for that mutual gain, but they are solving problems in public with all of their stakeholders involved. So someone really to learn from there. Veolia, community days are a really standard format. What's really interesting is to see a waste company looking at their future needs and working it as a strategic tool. So if you look at the Chartered Institute of Waste Management, I would say as an institute, they are way, way ahead in terms of identifying what their future looks like, what happens when waste is a primary resource, what skills are needed and where, and also what impact that might have on local communities. They know that support from local communities is key. So things like their Wonder Day for families and setting up infrastructure, setting up relationships through their partner organization to bring families in. They're highly networked locally. They know that this is the model for waste management through the kinds of growth in waste management, which is absolutely locked in the coming years. They know where waste is going, and they know that waste will be a primary resource within 10 years. And this is the path they're laying down for it. Also networking with other waste organizations. So again, very skilled, very strategic. And the last one that I'll put before you today is public practice. A collaborative talent pipeline, really, really interesting to see local government really working together. And this is something which, again, they're working in public. Their business plan is available online. You can look at how they were funded initially and how that collaboration happened in order to secure talent recruitment and retention for planning practice, which was dying a death because corporate interests were able to bring the money, the sexy projects, all of those things meant that public sector planning was just failing on all kinds of levels. So by collaborative and cohort working, they're able to bring through young people. They're able to literally create, revive a profession and a discipline through this. So what we're looking for examples of, and what we're trying to identify in terms of their skills agenda, is not the future of business. Business will always be competitive. And in fact, lots of NGOs are competitive. There are things we have to do ourselves because we do it better or because we rely on it for sustainability. There's also many things which we can do together, and they will create hugely better value. And that collaboration space is getting bigger. It's getting bigger for all the reasons that I said at the beginning, solving systemic problems, creating that kind of mutual benefit, which gives us security and stability through to the future. We also have a kind of a blurry space in the middle: competition, relational competition, open source competition. So there's lots of new and innovative ideas about what that kind of piece in the middle might look like, where some parts are competitive, but some parts perhaps aren't. And I think there's new norms, there's new cultures, there's new ideas and great inventiveness in this space, which we need to learn from. But when we did the session before Christmas, we had quite a lot of people in the room in the November session. And we talked to people about being open, about the experience on a personal, on an individual basis of being open. And this is the word cloud that resulted from ideas of being open. And I think it's very easy to talk about openness and collaboration in principle. It's very easy to call for collaboration, but actually it's a very vulnerable place to position yourself, either as an individual, and businesses are made up of individuals. We all need to enter these conversations as people who are paying attention to our businesses and paying attention to our careers and paying attention to our security. So those individuals who are entering these conversations are coming at it potentially from quite a defensive position. So the individual needs to pay attention to that. And then the organization needs to pay attention to that. So we're starting to build up this idea of what are the blockers. We got very, very bored of reading articles which were calling for collaboration and systemic transformation without paying attention to all the very, very understandable reasons to not do all the things that they're calling for. And we're starting to build out this list. And today, in fact, I'd like to break off in a minute, stop talking, and talk to you guys a little bit just about which of these chime. So the idea that it's a convention to work in a closed way. You might not have the imagination to work outside your boundaries or the interest, because if you can keep things inside your control, you're incentivized to do that, often through your bonus or through your shareholder value, or whatever that is that keeps you in there. There might be some legal reasons. You might not, whether that's through your kind of company articles right the way through to competition law. There might be legal reasons not to work more openly and collaborate. You might either lack partners or not be able to identify partners, or those partners might not be working at the right timing for you, because timing is also part of it. And then within that, you've got the risks of bad actors. Not everyone is working for good, and the assumption that everyone is potentially naive and could put you again back into that kind of, lacking control and getting yourselves into situations that you cannot follow through on. Infrastructure, I think, is a really interesting question. So do you have the networks? Do you have the processes? Do you have the routines? What needs to be redesigned? in terms of working style or in terms of tangible. It could be space, it could be equipment, there could be tools, there could be really big things which stop you carrying that through. And then the big one to us, unhyphenated at the bottom, is know-how. And that's our agenda, which I'll be coming back to in a minute. But I just wanted to ask you guys, and it might be in the chat, I mean, there's a small group this time, but I was really taken by people's perspectives in the chat before Christmas. Oh, and Sam's losing. So it's literally Jill and, thanks for coming, Sam. Jill and Doug, would you like to just have a quick chip in on any observations you've had with people you work with or situations that you're in that might kind of inform that conversation about the last slide? What are the primary blockers to working more collaboratively?
So for me, one of the primary blockers is an imbalance of power.
Yep.
And that might come from resources. So if you're working with a partner, you know, or there are parties in the collaboration who have multiple resources and everyone's paid to be in the room, and you're working with a bunch of people who are not paid at all, or yourself as a partner, those kinds of things really kind of distort the stuff. And it's like putting in place the ability to try and level that.
Yeah.
I don't know what those things are.
Yeah.
But that's the first thing it made me think of. And I'm sorry I was late.
Oh, no. Don't be. I was saying when we started, you know, we had totally forgotten to promote this in between times. So we had 40 or more, 40, almost 50 signups for the one before Christmas and like 11 for this one. But I was like, I'm doing it anyway. I don't care. I'm interested in the conversation. And that's a really interesting point about the imbalance of power, and particularly when you're trying to build. And I have great experience, as you know, of sitting in the room, being the only unpaid person, you know, especially when you look around and you need community voices in the room, or you need NGOs in the room, and often that imbalance of power. And I know, Doug, you've been working in the community trying to put through projects also. Is that your experience?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about here. I'm just soaking it in. Actually, Dee, it's really fantastic hearing this presentation, because it's really formalizing so many of that kind of the tension between a language within a lot of organizations, a kind of an expressed desire for innovation, for change, for community work, and a complete disconnect then with actualization and what that looks like and what that truly means, the resources required, and the need for people within an organization that are innovators and disruptors who ask for the new, but actually is it really quite hard to play that role within a fixed industry. I've now actually moved out of frontline community delivery, and I'm working within architecture on how we get more authentic engagement and social value through architecture. And so there's quite a lot of disruption potential in that field, but all the drivers sit on the other side around, you know, profit and patriarchal kind of studio-led design, and that's just such a streamlined process that there's lots of drivers in government procurement, there's lots of nice words being said, but actually just the resources within organizations to encourage the kind of passion of individuals that are needed to shake things up is really challenging. It's a really challenging role to be the instigator in these structured systems, even if strategically the language is there that says they want to support it. Yeah.
And that thing about individual risk as well, associating if you're trying to drive something through which is associated with risk by definition because it's new, but then you're associated with it, the personal cost of that or the professional cost of that can be significant.
And the need for everything to be a win, and this kind of learning through failure is such a hard thing to bring into these commercial environments. So the permission to try something and fail, you can't have innovation without failure. And that's where there's a real disconnect in how many people are really prepared to take a risk to learn versus wanting. And this is why I love so much of this in sharing learning and being much more open source around packages and systems that have a track record, is it de-risks some of these things.
And I think the perception of risk, I think that's what we're going to be working into quite a bit through this series, is the perception of risk also, because I think it's been interesting to see some of the post-growth voices starting to get more attention over the last, I would say, 6 months, maybe, and to see people like the Donut Economics Action Lab, when you look deeper into what they're doing, they're only interested in businesses which are doing deep design, they call it. So they're not interested in people who are doing projects, who are, you know, testing the water. They're interested in people who recognize that their economic model may be flawed, because business, almost by definition, cannot do some of the things that we're talking about because they're incentivized. It's not only culture, it's also the way that governance is set up to maximize shareholder value. It's not in their DNA to collaborate. And I think that's the shift we're trying to kind of dig into. I think we're trying to have a conversation in the now about taking action, because we don't see any kind of change happening without that. And then there's multiple, I think, really interesting bodies looking at the bigger picture, the bigger change that needs to happen. So I'll just jump back in, and we'll have another few minutes, I hope, for a little chat at the end. And that's really interesting. And I'll just tell you what we're trying to identify in terms of our agenda, because we're focused in on. So obviously we've taken this rationale saying it's inevitable, it's happening. It might come through multiple business failure. You know, if you look at any people commenting on security of supply chains, you know, et cetera, the kinds of existential threats to businesses are rising. So we're saying, okay, we're locked in. They are no longer optional. And this is becoming more and more accepted in a business environment, or certain parts of the business environment. And I would say including big business, because they're so big, they need to recognize these threats. So when you look at insurers or reinsurance markets, big business are starting to really work into this. I think it's the medium-sized and smaller businesses who haven't quite understood the scale of threat and the need for change. So we're saying it's no longer optional. We want to spread this. The thing that we're focusing in on, obviously, is know-how, because none of these conventions can be threatened. None of that imagination can be ignited if you don't have the know-how. And the work we're doing with UCL's Climate Action Unit, who are really interesting on the idea that it's action first. It's not persuasion. It's not maths and stats that are going to drive change, that it's action first, and that action can drive beliefs and can drive that change. So influenced by them, we're starting to look at what is the know-how. And the know-how we're saying, obviously, from here, we know it's to do with emergent practice and innovation. So this middle set, some businesses will stay in the simple. They will be very straightforward, whether that's services or certain parts of retail, certain parts of local and circular industries where they can kind of capture value in a very low impact way. They'll stay in the simple, and some will fit into complicated and never verge into complex. But most, particularly manufacturing industry, anything which is material intensive, sits in complex. They have longer supply chains. They have more resource extraction. They make things, tangible things, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of business sit in this complex world, and that dialogue and debate, innovation, trial and error, the know-how to do that is the only thing that's going to move this conversation forward for them. So this is a grid. I do love a grid, and I try not to share too many of them, but this is what we're focusing on firsthand, really. And this will become a diagram at some point. And it's not, if you look across the top, you know, establishing need or opportunity, figuring out who your partners are, a design process around that, a delivery process around that, and iteration. This is a very standard development process, which, you know, will sit in a circle at some point. But we're looking at what are the essential skills, by which we mean those kind of building blocks on which any other competencies are built, sit, and then what those kind of green competencies. And our touchstones in this are skills builder, which identifies essential skills. We're interested in interoperable frameworks, not inventing our own. So we're touching base with skills builder for essential skills, and the European Green Comp framework for the green competencies. Interoperable frameworks, which lots of businesses, communities, educational institutions, etc., can recognize in each other, can build and scale together. So we're looking at what that skills agenda is, and how you're seeing that in these examples, because it's not something that you go off and do a PhD on and come back in 6 years' time and see what you can build it. We're trying to build a community of practice, a broad community of practice, and then specific case studies through visits, through live events, through workshops, etc., that can take these and other examples and pick them apart and understand what we're talking about when we're talking about these skills. Because what you will find is, if you talk to local government and you talk to industry, they're talking about different things. If you talk to academia, they're talking about different things. We did a session last week with our community of practice on critical thinking, which almost broke all of our heads. And yet all of us had claimed to have critical thinking as a learning outcome of one of our programs in all of our contexts. And yet we were talking about different things and comparing that to literature and comparing that to where it might go as a central green competency at the top of everyone's, future workplace skills. Those conversations need to be had not only in L&D and business, but in the community, in a much broader community, which takes in perspectives from those other stakeholders and is developed together outside those silos. So it's a conversation for L&D, but it's also for education right the way through the education system. It's a conversation for local government, and it's definitely a conversation for advocacy and sector groups and those people who look to the future beyond what business is probably capable of doing, because they need to pay attention to that kind of closer midterm. So we're sticking tight with this. We're doing it through these real world learning events. I think you've seen probably me blasting these on LinkedIn a little bit, because that's our main channel at the moment, just to kind of, develop the templates. We're starting this conversation, and I think this is the way that we're building our platform, is that the learning events, the tours, the field trips, the real world learning opportunities then feeds back into this learning ecosystem. And to us, these kinds of events, this session today, even with just the lovely two of you with us, that gives us a forum and a conversation and a way of widening it alongside our community of practice, which is our 12 or 14 kind of deeper experts. And then those other networks which are coming through and the partnerships we're building to do these field trips. And the field trips this year are looking awesome. We're going to be going out with more details in March. But right now, we're looking at a whole itinerary of food systems walking tours in London, circular material systems walking tours in London through the springtime and again in the autumn time. We're doing a field trip to the Midlands at the end of June or beginning of July, which is looking at Stoke-on-Trent and nerdy things like the Clean Air Act of 1959 and how that actually transforms. So in the same way that we looked at Brunel to really take lessons from the past about how we might deal with infrastructure change now, and then looking at projects around Derby, which are really seriously looking to the future in this kind of post-industrial landscape. We're going to Orkney for the Science Festival in the first week of September, working with Community Energy Scotland and the Science Festival there. We'll be co-hosting, looks like, fingers crossed, a mini COP up there, and visiting a number of the big the energy innovation sites up there with again a mixed audience of local community professionals who've been working on this energy innovation, all community-owned energy innovation over the last 20 years or more, and bringing our experts and it'll actually be open invite and Science Festival attendees as well. And then we're in conversation about a trip to Barcelona looking at food systems. So these field trips are really working through this skills agenda. This skills agenda in detail, on site, in reality, often hands-on. And that's the way that we're seeing this, our kind of contribution to this conversation and the different networks, interfacing with the different networks. And that is our project. And we still have a few minutes left. If there's anything that strikes either of you that you'd like to share, it would be great to hear. Closing that.